So OLED or Switch 2, and if you already have a Switch OLED, is the Switch 2 a worthy upgrade? Well, the OLED can be snaffled these days for around £250, while the Switch 2, if you actually manage to find the bastard, will set you back a pocket-drilling £400. Still, the Switch 2 does sort out many of the complaints with the original Switch and Switch OLED. Finally, we've got that long overdue performance boost, as well as a 1080p display to make the most of those most trouser-rousing Switch titles. Now, I've been gaming on the Switch OLED for over 3 years now, but this past month I switched to the Switch 2. So here's a rambly stream of opinions from a grumpy old twat who still reckons the gaming peaked with Jet Set Willy. And for more on the latest and greatest tech, please do subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Cheers! Now I'm going to kick off by stating the pretty bleeding obvious, which is that the Switch 2 is significantly bigger than the Switch OLED. As you can see, it is both taller and wider, although thankfully only slightly chunkier. Now thankfully we're not talking Steam Deck levels of chunkiness here, but the Switch 2 is certainly more difficult to cram into a busy bag compared with the old Switch OLED. And when I travel, I've usually got DSLRs and laptops and all kinds of bulky tech squashed into my backpack. Such is the joys of being a content creator instead of having a proper job like a normal grown-up. And with the Switch OLED, I can usually just about stuff it in there without even thinking twice, but with the Switch 2, it's just that little bit more bulky, slightly more cumbersome, to the point where I'm like, oh, do I really need to take it? In fact, the Switch OLED I can actually comfortably fit inside of my pants at a pinch, even if I'm wearing jeans. But if I try the same with the Switch 2, let's face it, I'll be walking funny for a fortnight. Oh, and there goes the old pubis popping out of joint again. And the 420-gram Switch OLED is also pleasingly lightweight for a handheld gaming console, whereas the Switch 2 is a far meatier 535 grams. Although I've got to say, even if I'm gaming on this thing for a good couple of hours, I haven't found that clutching it makes my biceps ache in any particular way, even when reclining on a sofa or in bed. And you know, I don't think I'm going to be challenging Jason Momoa for the title of henchiest dude anytime soon. Like the OLED, it's once again a perfectly comfortable gaming experience. You've got these handy little bits up at the top here, just underneath the shoulder buttons where it curves outwards, just provides a bit of finger rest action. Keeps the Switch 2 from slipping out of your grip. And you've once again got a handy pull-out rear stand which can be adjusted to pretty much any angle you like, which is ideal if you just want to kick back and watch something on the Switch 2, or get some multiplayer gaming action on the go without actually docking the Switch 2, which is particularly handy if you're traveling somewhere by train, for instance. And the port and the button placement very similar on the Switch 2 compared with the Switch OLED, with the exception of the extra USB port which is slapped up top now. So you've got one on the top there and exactly the same as the Switch OLED, one on the bottom. So this means the Switch 2 is more flexible when it comes to charging. You can either plug it in from the bottom to charge it up, otherwise you can shove it in the top there. Both will charge up the Switch 2 console, or alternatively you can charge the device and also connect an accessory at the same time, like for instance one of the compatible webcams. As for the actual dock to get the Switch 2 hooked up to the telly, well, this has grown in size a wee bit compared with the original. This is actually a proper full-on chunkster now because they've squeezed a fan in there to help keep everything cool when you are docked. You've still got that LAN port for getting online, as well as the power port and the HDMI port. And here on the outside, a pair of USB-A ports. If I had to put my grumbly pants on, I would have preferred maybe a USB-C and a USB-A just to mix it up a bit. But hey, it's a pretty tidy setup, and now of course you can enjoy a good bit of 4K resolution gaming when you are docked, as long as you're playing a title that supports it. Now, 1 month on from the launch, there are still very few games out there which the Switch 2 can run, which the Switch OLED can't. Kinda sounded like piss poor grammar, but let's just swiftly move along, shall we? Mario Kart World is of course the big one right now, which is unsurprisingly a pretty fantastic multiplayer game. Particularly good if you gather together a bunch of friends and a couple of crates of booze and have at it. And it's also a cracker for those Sunday afternoons with the family when you can't be asked to actually go out and do stuff. The Knockout Tour is the standout addition here, proving incredibly tense as you struggle to keep ahead of the pack and not get yourself booted out. And Nintendo also tried to make the game a bit more interesting for single players with the likes of the open world shenanigans. But I gotta say, that mode, certainly personally for me, just feels a little bit aimless at times. Lots of driving around just looking for stuff to do. And the multiplayer experience on Mario Kart World isn't quite as good as Mario Kart 8 or Double Dash. But no doubt it's what most Switch 2 owners will be playing online for several months to come. However, gotta say, the Switch 2 exclusive that I've been all over this past month isn't Mario Kart World, it's actually the Gamecube emulator, which is free to download and play on as long as you've got the Billy Big Bollocks Switch Online subscription. Now sadly, that Gamecube emulator isn't compatible with the Switch OLED, unlike all of Nintendo's other emulators that you can download, the Game Boy, the N64, etc., because I guess it just needs that little extra bit of performance. And of course the Game Boy, the SNES, the N64 emulators all absolutely stuffed to the gut with wall-to-wall classic bangers. Now in contrast, the Gamecube emulator sadly only serves up a choice of 4 games right now, but one of those is Super Mario Strikers, which is an even better multiplayer game than Mario Kart World, dare I say, and possibly the best footy game ever made outside of Sensible's Soccer. Again, as long as you've got a plentiful supply of mates and booze. I tell you what, VAR would absolutely its pants at some of the shenanigans going on here. And the Gamecube emulator also includes F-Zero GX, which is a decent enough Wipeout style racer, and Wind Waker, which is still one of my favourite Zelda games outside of Ocarina of Time and Link's Awakening. And yes, that does unfortunately include the slightly overrated Breath of the Wild, 99% of which just reminds me of the boring driving between missions bits in Grand Theft Auto. Except that instead of being in a fast fun car, you're on a dumb horse which clips on seemingly every pebble and blade of grass. But you know, hey, I'm old, alright. Maybe, you know, in a decade or so you'll be on whatever apocalyptic pit of despair the internet has turned into, moaning about Legend of Zelda Guff of the Ancients on Nintendo Switch 5, saying it's nowhere near as good as all the classics like Breath of the Wild. And then you'll suddenly realise, oh shit, now I'm the grumpy old git that all the young'uns rip the piss out of constantly. And so in terms of the actual games catalogue, the Switch 2 has a pretty meagre offering of titles right now that are excluded entirely from the OLED. But of course this is obviously going to expand, including quite a few Nintendo first-party titles. The likes of Donkey Kong and Kirby are going to be Switch 2 exclusives, and no doubt there'll be a few indie titles trickling through as well. So if you are the kind of gamer who gets serious FOMO, well, you might want to grab yourself a Switch 2. But of course, don't blow your entire savings on one, because then all of the games are going to cost you 60, 70 quid each on top of that. So definitely start saving up now, or perhaps just lure a friendly orphan or two back to your basement so you can start harvesting those precious organs. But while the catalogue isn't particularly impressive right now, where the Switch 2 really does excel compared with the Switch OLED is the proper boot up the arse for performance. More ambitious titles like Breath of the Wild are certainly hampered by the less than impressive performance here on the Switch OLED. And let's face it, this thing's packing less power than a guinea pig's fart. And so even though Zelda was one of the bloody launch titles on the original Switch, no less, Nintendo's handhelds have always struggled to maintain a smooth frame rate, especially in busier areas, or at least until now. Breath of the Wild plays near flawlessly here on the Switch 2, sticking at 60 frames per second pretty much no matter what. While I may not be the biggest fan of Breath of the Wild, I certainly can appreciate it a lot more now that the performance is satisfyingly smooth. And likewise, intensive third-party titles like Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk are a lot happier running on the Switch 2 compared with the frankly sludgy shenanigans you'll experience on the Switch OLED. And I didn't experience any heating issues whatsoever, whether I was using the Switch 2 in handheld mode or I had it docked. Stays nice and cool even with hours of gameplay, and it remains whisper quiet as well. And courtesy of that performance boost, a lot of Switch games have now been upgraded with enhanced graphics to really make the most of the Switch 2's 1080p Full HD display. So for instance, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom both have an upgrade pass which you can buy for 8 quid, or it is mercifully free to download if you're on the posh Switch Online subscription. It is a bit of a jip that you have to pay for this graphics enhancement. Certainly if you're a PC gamer, you expect these kind of visual enhancements for free most of the time. I've got to say, it is a wee bit stingy that they didn't hoy in the DLC for Breath of the Wild with that upgrade pass. pack. Not that I need more of it to play. And to be honest, I'm a bit on the fence when it comes to the graphics upgrade for Breath of the Wild, as I don't really think it helps the title much at all. The drawn distance seems to be a wee bit further now, so you can see even more empty fields and hills than before, but I did still experience a fair bit of pop-in when roaming about. And while everything looks a bit smoother, I would struggle to say that it actually looks any better. And it is a matter of personal taste, of course, but I gotta say I do prefer that OLED panel on the Switch OLED to the display on the Switch 2, even if the OLED screen is a wee bit smaller and just maxes out its 720p resolution. The contrast just isn't as good despite all of the HDR hype on the Switch 2. Those blacks are more of a dark grey, while whites are just a bit more murky. And there's also been an awful lot of online flinging this past month about the Switch 2's screen featuring a slower response than the Switch OLED, which can result in blurry graphics. Now, personally, I've got to say I haven't noticed this even in the countless numbers of fast-paced action titles and platformers that I've played, although that may say more about my knackered old peepers than this bloody panel. If you record the gameplay on both the Switch OLED and the Switch 2 and then slow the footage down, you will notice a bit of difference, a bit more blurring on the Switch 2. But honestly, when you're actually there gaming with it, even right in front of your face, I haven't noticed any of that going on. As for the brightness levels, well, the Switch 2 is on a par with the Switch OLED, although the OLED just about wins for overall clarity when you are playing in brighter environments. I was certainly quite happy, sat outside in the garden. As long as I had a bit of shade and didn't have the sun glaring right off those reflective displays, I could generally see what was going on without having to squint, play for a good couple of hours without getting a sodden migraine. But all the same, if you're playing the likes of Breath of the Wild outside and attempting to navigate through a forest at night, well, good bloody luck. You'll either be off a cliff or you'll have had your pretty face punched in by a bloody skeleton before you even know what's going on. As for the stereo speaker setup on the Nintendo Switch 2, well, these are once again housed here on the bottom edge, just as they were on the Switch OLED. And I gotta say, they are a bit louder and a little bit beefier here on the Switch 2 compared with that Switch OLED. Here's a side-by-side comparison. So clarity is a wee bit stronger, certainly a little bit louder, and just overall just a nicer sound. But of course you once again have a headphone jack housed up top, just like on the Switch OLED. Good news if you fancy a bit of privacy instead, and you've got full Bluetooth audio support as well. Now, you'll still have to manually connect to your headphones every time, but far worse, there's clear lag when you're using Bluetooth headphones or earbuds, usually about half a second or so, which is incredibly distracting, especially when you're playing some sort of fast-paced action game. It's all too obvious, so I would say definitely steer clear of Bluetooth, just use the old wired connection if possible. And oh yes, if you are using a Bluetooth headset of some description, well, there's sod all support for mics. As for the actual Joy-Cons and the general controls, these are essentially the same here on the Switch 2 compared with the Switch OLED, with the exception of the chat button, which has been added down here. However, the Joy-Cons do snap off and on a lot more easily than the old ones on the OLED, which are always kind of fiddly and bloody annoying. I've got to say, this new method is rather satisfying in some sad little way. Unfortunately, Nintendo has once again cheaped out and not gone for Hall effect thumbsticks, so you can expect plenty of aggrieved people moaning and complaining on Reddit that they're getting a good bit of drift any day now. Gotta say though, that slightly enlarged size for the Switch 2 Joy-Cons makes them less torturous to use as a standalone controller when you're doing a bit of local multiplayer or whatever. No longer do I suffer violent hand cramps after half an hour of gaming, and then spend the rest of the day locked in Action Man grip mode, which certainly gets you quite a few suspicious looks on the tube. But the big new flop for me, as far as the Switch 2 is concerned, is certainly the mouse controls. You just disconnect one of the controllers, slap it down on a flat surface like so, and it immediately starts working as a mouse here in the menus, which is great and all. You can use the L or the R button to actually select things, and you've still got full use of the old thumbstick and the buttons. And as a massive fan of point-and-click adventure games and first-person shooters, I was immediately like, what a fantastic idea. Really intrigued to see how well it would work. because I just assumed that it would work in all of the existing Switch games like it does on the mouse mode on the Lenovo Legion Go, for instance. But no, for some reason only a small handful of titles actually seem to support the mouse mode, which is a real bloody shame because it could have been something special on the likes of Metroid Prime and other first-person shooters. And also it works much better on some surfaces compared with others. So for instance, on the slightly rough surface of my wooden desk, absolutely fine. But if I try playing on any of my glass coffee tables, no f***ing chance. So overall, gotta say, plop. And with the Switch 2 being considerably bigger than the Switch OLED, now I was really hoping for an upgrade to the battery life for those long haul flights. But sadly, the Switch 2 keels over even quicker than the Switch OLED. Although it's certainly not as bad as some of those Windows handheld gamers. Now, proper Switch 2 games will drain it rather fast, so with the likes of Mario Kart and Breath of the Wild with the upgrade pack, you can expect around 2.5 hours of playtime from a full charge. That is with the screen brightness turned up to the maximum levels. However, on the flip side, some Switch 1 titles like Mario Odyssey can be played for just under 4 hours on a full charge, while the Switch 2 can survive for closer to 5 hours if you're playing some more basic indie games. And yes, the Switch 2's battery does still tend to drain even when the device is hibernating, so I usually fully power it down just to prevent that. Because you know, sod's law, you'll hibernate it, you'll come back to it a week later just before you're about to bugger off on a long journey and it'll be down to like 12%. And it's still pretty slow when it comes to the recharging, just like the Switch OLED. You'll need to plug it in for a good couple of hours to fully charge it up if it is drained. So not ideal again if you realise it's almost out of power when you're just about to bugger off. However, on the storage front, thank God Nintendo has significantly boosted it. It was just 64 gigs on the Switch OLED, so I was constantly having to delete old games to put fresh new ones on there, whereas that's been boosted to 256 gigs for the Switch 2. So I've downloaded tons of stuff onto this thing, and so far I'm yet to receive the dreaded insufficient space warning. You've also got micro SD Express card support on this thing, which is faster to access compared with the bog standard micro SD support on the original Switch OLED. Now this review is grown to rather epic proportions, but a couple more final things I just want to quickly mention. The new game chat feature, for instance, on here. Pretty easy to jump straight into an online conversation with your mate, do a bit of screen sharing, play some games of course. It seems to work pretty well unless you or one of your friends is in quite a noisy household with small screeching children, then that tends to be all you can really hear. But certainly works better than expected. And I also really like the new game share feature, which is enabled here on Switch 2. Now this allows Switch 2 owners to share their games locally with other Switch 1 or 2 consoles. You can also apparently try it online, although I haven't used this mode. But certainly locally it works really well, absolutely zero lag, which is impressive. So you can enjoy a good bit of multiplayer with only one copy of the game. And of course this is the kind of feature we have seen on handheld gaming consoles in the past. It's always great to see. And the only problem right now is it's not supported by a huge number of games, so hopefully the catalogue will expand rapidly in the future. But yes, on the Switch OLED you can join a game share game beamed out by a Switch 2 console, but you can't actually share your game. And there you have it, my lovelies. That in a tasty wee nutshell is what I reckon of the Nintendo Switch 2 after gaming on this big old beast for just over a month now. And certainly if you don't have yourself a Steam Deck or anything like that and you want to play those more intensive titles like Cyberpunk and Witcher 3, which frankly run like a soggy sack of arse gravy on the Switch OLED, you might want to seriously consider an upgrade to the Switch 2. Likewise, if you're a sucker for those first-party Nintendo titles, the likes of Donkey Kong, Mario, Kirby, etc., well, it seems like they're going to be Switch 2 exclusives going forwards. Really like some of those new features like the game share, just hope that actually gets a good bit of love and is supported by lots more titles in the near future. But for everything else, I gotta say I prefer the Switch OLED, especially when I'm traveling because it's smaller, it's lighter, it's got longer battery life, it's frankly got a better display even if it isn't quite as crispy. And of course if you're going for one or the other, this has got a much more palatable price tag. You can actually find it in shops. That's what I reckon. Anyway, what do you think? Have you got yourself a Switch 2? Have you been enjoying it thus far? What are your biggest qualms with it? And do you reckon it's a big enough upgrade versus the OLED? It'd be great to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe and ding that notifications bell, or the usual YouTube guff. and have yourselves a ruddy, wonderful rest of the week. Cheers, everyone. Love you all.